very important topic, the role of government in contemporary economic systems. And I'm going to introduce both of them to you, but before I do, let me make an announcement. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Okay, a lot of times we forget, but go ahead and turn it off. Okay. Let me introduce Professor Chambliss first, from Valencia College. He's economics at Valencia College for 12 years. He earned undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Oklahoma and North Carolina State, respectively. His fields include biological, labor, and energy economics, and political economy as well. He's authored 2 economics textbooks, numerous articles, and appeared on ABC's Nightline, CNBC's Inside Opinion, and Fox News. He speaks frequently on the role of government and economics and on issues economic liberty. He regularly contributes articles to the Orlando Sentinel, and he's a descendant of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Professor Chambliss. Our other debater discussion will be Professor Charles Rock from Rollins College. College for 19 years, earned an undergraduate degree from Williams College and graduate degrees from High University and Cornell University. Fields include labor economics, European economic history, development economics, and political economy. Professor Rock is a former Peace Corps worker in Botswana, works with the Farm Workers Association of Florida. He has taught in Denmark, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Ireland, has authored numerous articles, monographs, and is on the board of editors of 3 professional journals. Professor Rock. Now let me briefly explain the format of tonight's debate and discussion. Each speaker, starting with Professor Chambliss, will speak for 20 minutes, one right after the other, and then we'll a 10-minute rebuttal after each speaker. So I have 20, 20, 10, and 10. I'm going to keep time on that. And then after this is over, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Any questions you want for either of the participants. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Jack Chambliss.
Very much an honor to be here and see a standing room only crowd. Although since I'm a believer in self-interest, I'm sure many of you here because of extra credit. So those of you who are self-interested individuals for that reason, you're as welcome as anybody else. I'm glad to be here to talk to Professor Rock and you tonight. I think in many instances we see things differently. We see the same problems, but maybe have different approaches to how best to fix them. As you heard, I speak often on the issue of liberty and government, the role of government in contemporary economic systems. And I've reached several conclusions in the 12, 13 years that I've been a professional economist, and that is individuals work and government doesn't. If we look around the world, as a matter of fact, if we look around Winter Park, I got here, I think it's because I'm from Germany, I have to be early for everything, so I got here about 2.5 hours early, and I was walking around Winter Park, and it struck me how ironic it is that I'm in Winter Park, Florida, defending the free market. If there's any place where you want to see the free market celebrated, it is Winter Park, Florida. I recall seeing an email that went out to describe this debate from one of the students, one of your colleagues here, and it said something to the effect, come see Mr. Rock against the pro-market or versus the pro-market professor from Valencia. I also find that ironic, being in a business school setting, to be called pro-market. It seems like having a science debate and calling me pro-gravity. But then again, I did once read an article entitled Business Students Who Hate Business, so I had to figure that out. But anyway. Today in the mail, I received an interesting catalog that Mrs. Chambliss is going to be very interested in me using. It's the Godiva Chocolates catalog. And as I was looking through this, I was wondering, what is it that gives us chocolate, gives us milk, gives us beer, drugs for those of you that use them on occasion? Well, every night we go to bed and we sleep very peacefully, never tossing and turning, never wondering if any of these things are going to be on the shelves of America's stores. Never any doubt. It doesn't matter if it's something that we want or something that we need. We know instinctively it's going to be there. And that has as much to do with the lessons of Adam Smith that many of you know about as it has to do with biology. When we're born, and I have 3 children, so I've had a chance to watch these individuals. When we're born, at some point, we start crawling away from our parents. We seek to be free. My children, it is in their self-interest to run into the street, and I have to secure them and ask them and redirect them away from the street. But they still want to be free. My children also respect the idea of private property. I see my son playing with a toy. 4 years old, he's playing with a toy, and if his 3-year-old brother comes and jerks it out of his hand, I rarely see them engaging in a conversation where they say, thine, thine, no, this is yours, why don't we share? We teach sharing, but instinctively they're pursuing their self-interest. The role of government in our contemporary economic system is very simple. The role of government is to appreciate the fact that we are self-interested, that you're here now getting a college education because there's an imbalance between, well, for many of you anyway, there's an imbalance between how much money you now make and how much money you would like to make over the course of your lives, and you are pursuing your self-interest to be here. For those that may join something of the equivalent of the Peace Corps, that also is a self-interested activity. People derive a great deal of pleasure from being benevolent and charitable. And charity and benevolence is a wonderful thing. It's something that should be celebrated, and it should be supported. It should be encouraged. Our founding fathers encouraged local communities to be charitable, to help one another, to help themselves. However, our founders also understood that people are self-interested, and if the government respects that and channels our self-interested behavior in a positive way, that wonderful things can happen. What I mean by that is, government has a responsibility to all of us to protect our rights. This is my opinion. And our rights very clearly. Nobody in here should be allowed to kill you because you've attended this debate, or kill you for any reason when you're engaging in peaceful activities. You have the right to your life. In my opinion, you have the right to do anything that's peaceful, and you have the right to your property. By that, property doesn't necessarily have to be land. It can be the blouse or you're wearing or the shoes you're wearing. I do not believe anybody has the right to take that away from you for any reason. Theft is theft. If government tells individuals, here's what we're going to do. You pursue your self-interest in a way that does not kill people. It does not take away people's right to do things as peaceful. It does not take away our property. And if government were to only do that and celebrate the fact that people will pursue self-interested activities in a positive way after that, then we would have a real free market economy. We don't have a free market economy now. We do not. For example, you may know that right now in Miami there are people protesting the concept of free trade. These are people that go to grocery stores and trade with farmers, and people that buy clothing at Gap and other places. But they're protesting the idea of trade. What they perhaps should be protesting is the idea that the United States of America does not believe in the free market when it comes to international trade. We practice hypocrisy. For example, as I was telling my students this past week, the trade negotiations in Cancun recently broke down because West African countries that we keep preaching free trade to, they came into the negotiating room and said, could you please stop giving millionaire cotton farmers taxpayer dollars to subsidize cotton that creates surplus cotton that ends up being exported to West Africa, where we sit here in West Africa unable to earn a profit from what we have a comparative advantage in. America preaches free trade, and then, as the New York Times reported, and I know they've had trouble telling the truth recently, but anyway, the New York Times reported that the Bush administration told the representatives from West Africa that we would study cotton, but maybe they should consider growing some other crop. That's not a free market. The steel tariff we recently got, the World Trade Organization says You're violating the ideas that you agreed to with the WTO to engage in free trade, to let us pursue our self-interest. Where if Poland or Korea is better producing steel, you'll buy it from them. No, we don't do that. We have a steel industry that during the Arab oil embargo failed to modernize quickly enough. When they were faced with international competition where our competitors were becoming more energy efficient and lowering the cost of making steel, our steel industry ran straight to Washington, D.C., begged for and got tariff protection, and ever since then, we have provided this artificial barrier to free trade for the steel industry, and it's kept them from improving their productivity, and it's kept people in other countries that are better at making steel from being able to make a profit from doing it. So what do we do now? The WTO rules that it's illegal, and the Bush administration's initial indications that they're going to ignore the WTO, risking $2.2 billion in sanctions from Europe. And just today, the Bush administration announces quotas that we're going to place on bras from China and bathrobes from China and other products, even though we don't even have a company making bras in the United States of America. Maybe the Bush administration believes in his definition of free trade, that if the tariff or quota is high enough and restrictive enough, maybe some company will start making bras. What I'm trying to suggest here, just with international trade alone, is that we really don't have a free market economy here. If we had a free market economy, it would mean people pursuing their self-interest, freely trading with one another as individuals in America, freely trading internationally. It would also mean that the fruits of our labor that the founders spoke so eloquently about, which is our income, would not be touched by income taxes. If you assume that your income is your private property, as I suggest you should, how can we have a Constitution that guarantees the protection of life, liberty, and property? Protecting it means that nobody can come take it away from you. But our government has an income tax instead of what I would consider a more constitutional value-added tax on businesses or sales taxes on us, voluntary taxation. Instead, we have a progressive income tax structure that Marx recommended in the Communist Manifesto that tells people like here at Rollins or Valencia or anywhere else, what we want you to do is take risks, be successful, and the more successful you are, the more punitive we're going to be towards you for your success. But this is done in the name of benevolence. As all of you should know, the federal government this year is going to spend more than $2 trillion as its total budget. About half of that is going to be the forced confiscation of one person's private property to be given to somebody else. A famous French economist named Frédéric Bastiat said, "The state is that great fictitious entity where everybody lives at the expense of everybody else." Now I know there's senior citizens out there that can't afford prescription drugs. Of course, nobody's asking if they can't afford it because we don't ask about the car they drive or the house they live in. But let's just say we know that prescription drugs are unaffordable to some senior citizens. So the Bush administration, and with support from Democrats, is now proposing that your money be taken from you to buy medicine for senior citizens. I'd like to ask you what you would do if you read a newspaper article tomorrow morning and you heard about me getting arrested out here on Park Avenue. I was stopping people with very nice purses and very nice clothes at gunpoint saying, "Give me all of your money." And when I took the money, I told them, "Now I want you to follow me to Eckerd's. We're going to stand at the counter, and I promise you this plunder is going to be in the name of charity. I'm going to take the money I'm stealing from you and give it to all senior citizens who show up at Eckerd's, because the Bush plan has not yet been implemented, and I want to get a jump start on the act of forced benevolence." So, I robbed 10 people. Don't shoot anybody, but I robbed 10 people. They arrest me. You read about it the next day and say, "The nerve of this guy, going around stealing other people's money, even if he did it in the name of benevolence, he should go to jail." And I stand there before the judge and say, "Your Honor, do you understand? I was doing it because I love my fellow man." The judge would say, "Yes, loving your fellow man is very important. Giving all you want to give of your own money is very important." Last year, New York Times a couple of days ago reported that adjusted for inflation, Americans gave $240 billion to charity. That is more than the gross domestic product of Belgium or Sweden, places that take it by force. $240 billion, and it's even gone up during the last recession. We're a very giving people, but our federal government is now exercise its judgment over our judgment. And instead of telling individuals, go make money, and we encourage you to give to charity, we encourage you to help your fellow man, the federal government takes by force. If you believe that senior citizens have a right to file a claim on your private property, then you believe in theft and murder. Because if you write a letter to the IRS saying, "Dear IRS, I do not believe I should have to pay for my medicine and the medicine of senior citizens. Theft for any reason is immoral and unconstitutional. Therefore, I'm withholding $100 from my taxes this year that I'm not going to pay for free prescription drugs." The IRS will send you a letter. "Dear taxpayer, yes you will. Here's the interest payments and your payment schedule. Or we're going to put a lien on your house. Dear IRS, you're not taking my house. You're not going to confiscate my money for senior citizens. You're not going to confiscate $15 billion to give to the airline industry after September 11th when they didn't manage their affairs properly before September 11th. You're not going to give it to millionaire farmers. You're not going to give it to baseball stadium owners that want to build a new stadium just because the Marlins won the World Series. And of course the Marlins aren't going to give anybody free tickets for plundering the taxpayers. You're not going to steal for any reason. It's immoral and unconstitutional. If you tell the IRS that, your house will be gone and you'll go to jail. And if you try to defend your house, holding up the Constitution, claiming you have a Second Amendment right to do that, you will be shot dead in your yard. So I know it sounds great. Look, the problem with socialism is that socialists are so eager to do good that they're willing to engage in violence to do it. I don't understand that. I don't understand loving your fellow man enough to steal, and I don't understand the idea, straight out of the Communist Manifesto, that there should be an abolition of private property. If you believe that, you should turn to the person to your right, and if you like what they're wearing, just take it away from them. Well, maybe not. Now, so what do naive free market fundamentalists as myself see with respect to problems with the free market? Well, very little. You might say, well, what about the fact that black Americans earn so much less than white Americans? Yes, that's true. We've observed that. It is a reality. What about the fact that kids at Rollins, many of you went to private schools, your parents could afford it. Some of my students were homeschooled, your parents could afford it. Do you really care about black kids who are poor? Why aren't we asking the question, what are these kids doing in public schools? Public schools that, in my opinion, are criminal in their negligence to poor folks. Why? Because in most places around the country, if you're poor, you can't afford private school, you cannot afford homeschool, your only choice is to send your child to the school in your school's district. And if your district happens to be Jones High School, and a parent moves in from Alabama and sees the 2 F's in a row or whatever it is at Jones, and they say, "This is my child, I want them to go to a better public school," the government tells them, maybe you'll get lucky and go to a magnet school or a charter school. Maybe you should save some money and try to move to a better district. But in the United States of America, poor people do not have the same choice to get an education that richer people do. We have economic segregation of our schools. From 1619 to 1865, we enslaved blacks, and then for the next 100 years, there was Jim Crow laws. Since 1964, we have created the illusion of equal opportunity, but they really don't. Poverty comes from lack of education. So when a black kid from Jones graduates at the age of 18 with a degree that's totally worthless, we then tell them that's okay, because we've got an affirmative action program for you, either in the labor market or the market for college seats. We're going to make ourselves feel better by now giving you an opportunity to go to a college you're not even prepared for. We hear that free markets are bad for the environment. I'd like to ask you why it is that the poorest countries, the countries that are the most oppressed, why do they seem to have pollution problems far in excess of what we have? How is it that we see the free market creating ecotourism and phosphate-free detergent, bleach-free cotton shirts? We see the free market giving us better and better fuel economy. What is it about the free market? It's the drive for profit. Look, every time I take an airplane ride, I know that Delta Airlines doesn't care about me. They're self-interested. But they care about $149 million. That's the replacement cost of the new jet. When I take my seat, I just keep telling myself, $149 million. $149 million. Knowing they don't care about me, but they care enough about money that they're going to take off and land successfully most of the time. It's bad business to destroy the environment, because in today's age of the internet and environmental groups that are raising a ruckus about it, we're now calling capitalist attention to the money that can be made from protecting the environment. So I'm sure in your rebuttal and in your questions there will be other things that will come up, low earnings for migrant workers and other issues like that. I am as concerned about the plight of the poor, the environment, trade causing job losses in the textile industry as anybody else. But if you look at the root cause of most problems, you will find government somewhere with its hands all over it. Government is a necessary evil. As H.L. Mencken once said, government is a broker in pillage, and every election is an advanced auction on stolen goods. This is what the government does. But they get away with it, because as some of you, especially if you had my class, have heard, one of the great quotes of all time by Adolf Hitler: "The greatest gift to rulers is that men don't think." And my goal for you tonight, whether you walk out disagreeing or agreeing with me, is just to think more about those things that the free market gives us, and trust yourselves and the market more than you do now, if that is the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chambless. Next we'll have Professor Rollins.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be in such a packed audience and talk about economics. I don't think I've ever talked before such a large crowd before. And I'm pleased that Jack Chambless has come here, because we do have really serious differences. And I think they're serious in the sense that if we don't resolve them in some clear way, our country is going to be really at sea for many years to come. Let me just start with a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who argued that taxes are the price of civilization. And what he meant by that was, you've got to have some means by which you create public goods and a variety of other programs to make yourself a good society. Simply relying on self-interest would never do the trick. What I'd like to do is go through and talk about some of my biases. How do you try to think about this issue we're debating today? A little bit about the theory of markets and why government is absolutely necessary for any society. My biases. I start maybe with the fact that I'm a radical Democrat with a small d. Democratic governance is essential for any good life. And the participation, the quality of participation in that democracy, about how we shape society, decide on it for the future, is one of the critical ways we can realize our full human potential. It requires some equality of power, and the market unfortunately moves us away from that, by and large, the market alone. Second, I'm an egalitarian. Minimally, equality of opportunity, which is pretty much a consensus, at least rhetorically, in this country. But more so, egalitarian in the sense that I don't think anybody can be a full citizen without some basic material level of living. Simply through the market, there is no society that's ever achieved that, purely through the market, without strong government intervention. Third, I'm an economic Democrat, or a believer in economic democracy. That is, work, and the time we spend at work is an important part of the quality of life. And if you don't get respect, if you don't have any say on what you're doing, it inherently will become alienating and simply seen as a negative. That's kind of the way we talk about work a lot, that you're only really free when you're away from work. I work here because I've got some elements of freedom to participate in defining work that I couldn't get if I was in the private sector. Ecologically risk-averse. Consumption of materials now and the way we use the earth may or may not cause our great-grandchildren to spit on our graves and curse us in the future. the way we hand down the patrimony of material life and what they can do with it. Fifth, as far as individual psychology goes, I think the idea of what is natural is quite complex, and many people have pondered on it, and I've actually taught courses trying to figure it out myself. I'm a believer in free will, although my philosopher friends would argue that it's not really very true, that it may not even exist according to some philosophical positions. But this idea is that we create the life that we live, and we realize ourselves in part through that creation. And the market is a mechanism to help us get some things in life, but it should not be the dominant mechanism that spreads its tentacles throughout the rest of life, which it often does if left untamed. So how do we think about this role of government in society? Well, if we only focus on economics, it simplifies our problem. We can restrict the field of operation to just cost benefit, or depending on a particular theoretical bent, we can choose to narrow the role. But I prefer not to simply restrict it to there, but we will focus on that tonight, thinking about material life. How do we create the material life, which is the basis for us to go on and achieve all the other things that ultimately, late in life, most people realize are so much more important than the materiality aspects of life. Friendships, loved ones, the things we care about deeply. We could approach it from a radical individualistic position, as Professor Chambliss does, focusing on maximizing liberty to use the material world as we see fit if we're the property rights holders of that life, that piece of the world. Or we could take a broader view to say, well, simply individualism is not what makes me human, but the fact that we live in society with other people and the way we relate to them, not simply outside the market or outside all economic activity, is where we really realize ourselves. But I would argue that work is so important and defines us to such an extent that we really ought to consider thinking about how enlarging the scope of freedom and democracy in work. Freedom. Something that I take seriously, and I think we'll have some serious disputes about what freedom is. I would define freedom in several ways. There's the classical freedom or classical liberty point of view, which simply sees freedom as a negative thing, that is, the absence of constraint. Government, don't tread on me. And it arose in the 19th century when there was no single democracy where a majority of people could vote for their leaders. Mid-19th century, remember, in this country we only had full democracy in the 20th century. Great Britain as well was not democratic in the sense of having at least a majority of adult citizens having the right to vote until the 20th century. Negative liberty sees the government as evil, both politically, so we want protections for our human rights as stated, say, in our Bill of Rights, but also it's enlarged by economic thinkers to say every aspect that the government restrains us from using our property the way we want is somehow a loss of our freedom. Negative liberty. Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a very lovely essay on this in the 50s, argued that there was another way of thinking about it he called positive liberty. And it was this concept that unless you have the possibility of participating actively in life and defining and shaping the world, you're not really free. It's also connected to some of the ideas of a guy named A.K. Sen, an Indian economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1998 for his work on social welfare economics. And he argued, well, here's a guy in India going by the shop. He sees some bread and some rice in the shop. His kids are starving. It's a free market. There's a free labor market. The guy is starving. There's no jobs. Is he free? And since Sen argued, of course not. Any sensible person would argue he's not really free in any real, meaningful way. He's free to steal and go to jail, feed his kids, or not, and let them starve. This positive liberty is very important in the sense of the creation of democratic governance. That is, how do we create a really substantive, solid, grassroots democracy in a country? And I think I might agree with him, Professor Chambliss, on the fact that we have a very, very corrupt democracy that is dominated by what Charles Lindblom has written a very thoughtful book on the market, called Market Elites and Their Ability to Manage the System in Their Own Interests. I was just looking at a book today that goes through the hidden aspects of the welfare state, something we call tax expenditures, and figuring out who they really benefit. And by and large, most of the government programs favor the most affluent members of society. You could argue that to some extent there's no redistribution downward in our system. You could look at specific programs, but if you take the whole system, to some extent you could argue there's a system oriented towards redistributing incomes up at present. Especially in the last 2 decades when the data is patently clear, even to the hardest core market believers, that income is being redistributed up towards the most affluent, the most largest contributors to political campaigns, and the most influential in hiring lobbyists and turning government to their own purposes. There's some other aspects of liberty I could go into, and something I've been working on for quite a long time. To some extent, it's been hijacked by the free market-loving peoples of the world and combined with markets in one big package. You either buy it or you don't. And so you say, well, I'm not in favor of that. And they accuse you of being illiberal or in favor of non-freedom. I think it's much more complicated than that. What about the freedom of ecological liberty? One could argue that by leaving the world in a worse state for the next generation, we've denied them liberty. Freedom of hermitage. The ability to withdraw from society and create a hermit away from society, away from its material obsessions, is becoming more difficult in many societies. Probably even in this one. It's hard to find a place like that. Although some of the right-wing militia claim to have found it in Idaho, northern Idaho. I haven't checked that out yet. Freedom to collectively choose the future, to choose a policy we would like to as a majority, to operate our democracy. One could argue that the ultra-freedom position of the free market, where the government has no role except to keep us from being killed by whoever outside our country, is a very limited view of that. Theory of markets and why we need governments. Now, I realize that coming from where Professor Chambliss does, I'm not sure he would agree with the traditional mainstream theory of free markets, but this is generally the way economists tend to think about it. We tend to think about it technically, abstractly, using logical models in what's called the neoclassical or mainstream tradition. And I've got lots of strong criticisms of it, but I think they've identified some key problems with the market as an allocated mechanism. One is information. If there is not good information on both sides of the market, how do people know what to buy, or what to sell, at what price, or even know whether they should want something? Government often acts as an enforcer to try to ensure greater transparency between markets. Okay, I'm just checking my time here. Lose track. Some products, like healthcare, you go to the doctor and the doctor says you need an operation. You check all over the internet, you try to call up anybody who's in the medical profession, you still don't know whether you need it. But basically you go along on the recommendation of the provider. So basically, the provider of the service, the person who's going to make money on it, is telling you how much to consume of it. Healthcare is a very severe area of very severe information problem. Likewise in financial markets, I think if we just look at what's happened at corporations, now in the mutual funds industry, in fact, if you study the history of financial markets through history, you'll know that they are places where artful, self-interested financiers can take advantage of the people who are not inside the system. Connected to this is what we call the principal agent problem. Problem of monitoring people. If you have a labor market and you hire someone, you don't know what they're actually going to do as a worker. Or if you hire a CEO, you don't know if the guy's going to simply try to steal blindly from the corporation. So we've got all sorts of problems that's become a whole subset of economic literature on the principal agent problems associated with concepts like adverse selection. Who's going to buy insurance? Everybody who's lousy risk. And the people who are not bad risks will avoid it. So you'll be getting the worst customers. Who wants to borrow from banks the most? The people who perhaps have the worst chance of ever paying it back because they're crazy, they're out of their mind. The profitability of the venture they're trying to make is impossible. Or things like moral hazard. Once you get insurance, then you change your behavior. There's a rich literature here associated with a whole subset of economists who spent their lives trying to figure out these information problems. Some people, like Joe Stiglitz, argue that this is the most fundamental aspect of market, where they don't operate, as the theory says, to provide us with efficient allocation of resources and prices which are good signals. The prices are distorted, the allocation is distorted. We don't know if it's efficient, even in the technical, narrow sense that economists use. Second major failure, competition. We like to think that the discipline of the market prevents conspiracy among businesses. Just like Adam Smith pointed out in his Wealth of Nations, sometimes considered the forefather of economics, he has a famous quote where he describes a bunch of business people meeting in the local tavern. And of course, the first thing they turn to is how to screw the rest of the market, how to take advantage of everyone else, how to fix prices, a natural tendency within business. Given that the nature of business is very narrowly focused, it's not to become a good business, but rather to be a profitable business. So, problems with economies of scale. If you look at the international market today, one can make a strong case that through advertising, the multinational corporations of the world are able to achieve economies of scale, which means they're able to sell things even if they produce them at the same cost more cheaply, ultimately, to the consumer, because in some sense their advertising costs can be spread over a larger number of goods, larger quantity. In some sense, economies of scope, economies of marketing, economies of advertising are perhaps the most insidious aspect of global trade, in the sense that the bigger will continue to dominate and be even more dominant in the future as they capture larger and larger shares of the market. Third major problem with market is spillovers. Sometimes these are called externalities, like pollution, or you doing something in your yard that your neighbor really hates, or positive. For example, higher education. If you look at what you're getting from higher education, you're going to capture part of the value as we analyze it in this way. But part of the value everybody else captures, because we're all citizens in a nation where everyone is relatively well educated and therefore more productive. And so we all get some of the benefit from your being more educated. If we simply let private people only invest in education, what you'll often see is underinvestment because they can't capture all those positive externalities. You capture part of the value created by being better educated yourself, but not necessarily all of it, so therefore you're only going to invest up to the point where you get a direct payoff back. Externalities are widespread, pervasive, and cover more and more people. Just think about traffic jams in Orlando. When they built these roads, they thought, geez, there'd be a lot of roads and plenty of space. But when everyone starts jamming onto them, you, by driving on the road, taking advantage, creating a negative externality for everyone else. A wonderful book by a guy named Fred Hirsch called The Social Limits to Growth argued that we do this all the time, and more as we become a mass society with more and more people on the earth and around our major urban areas. The suburbs are a good case in point. The first people moved there to get away from the negatives of the city, green grass, open air, and then everybody else said, well, I want that too, but once everybody else moves out to the suburb, unfortunately, all the amenities that you moved there for may be gone because of the social crowding that you were trying to escape by moving out to wider spaces. fourth assumption is usually made, and I think it's implicit in Jack Chambliss' arguments, full employment. If you don't have full employment, you can't make any efficiency arguments within mainstream economics. And I would argue you can't make them outside of mainstream economics. For example, free trade, fine. These guys lose the jobs in North Carolina. The jobs show up in Africa, positive, because those are poor people, they really need the jobs. But the guys in North Carolina, what happens to them? Well, if you got really bad luck as a worker, because we privatize both benefits and costs so much more aggressively than most countries in the United States, the worker can lose his job, her pension, health care, and if the factory is a major component of employment in their house, in their neighborhood, their house value can collapse, which is the main form of saving that the vast majority of Americans hold their net savings in, that is the equity in their house. Let me go on quickly because I only got 30 seconds. Missing markets. There are missing markets, as people have been pointing out for 30, 40 years since Kenneth Arrow's famous work for which he received one of the first Nobel Prizes. Especially in finance and insurance, you cannot insure yourself against every potentiality in life. And the last thing, clearly, is the unequal distribution of income that markets tend to generate. Throughout history, there is a tendency, unrestrained markets, for greater and greater accumulations of wealth. To some extent, the rich get richer and the poor stagnate or get slightly better off. But the gap can often be growing, so inequalities grow. Anyway, I could go through the U.S. history and stuff, but let me hold to my time and argue that government, at the minimum, comes in and tries to repair these problems as best it can. And that's what is often done in our society where we don't like the government as well as other countries do, or trust it less than other countries do. As well as bring about a fairer society, more equal, capable of actually maintaining a democratic system where real people actually have a say in the government. Thanks.
Professor Chambliss, and I'll make some remarks about Professor Rock's talk, followed immediately by Professor Rock making comments about Professor Chambliss' talk. We'll open up the discussion.
That's a long list for 10 minutes, but I'll try to do the best I can. I'm sure some of the students will want to hold me to some of the things that I don't cover when it's your turn for an hour. First of all, on the issue of income inequality, it is true. In a free market, you will get income inequality. I'd like to borrow a moment from Winston Churchill, who says, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of the blessings. The inherent vice of socialism is the equal sharing of misery." I recall when I was 16 years old, I was working for Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they were exploiting me. This was a horrible job. My friends found that I was working there, with shoe polish. They wrote "chicken choker" all over my truck. When you're 16, that doesn't necessarily mean you work with chickens. But I'm sorry, that's a family program. But anyway, so I came home one day. This is 1982, and I'm making $3.35 an hour. I tell my father, I'm making $3.35 an hour. I hate this job. I deserve more money. He said, what do you mean by deserve? Well, I should get more. I'm working hard and burned myself with grease the other day. And he said, well, what have you done to deserve more money? Well, of course, there's no answer to that, because the word deserve, like the word fair, is in the eye of the beholder. Am I earning a fair salary at Valencia? I don't know. Some of my students said, no, you should be getting nothing for what you're doing. But my father said, if you don't like making $3.35 an hour, do something about it. Now, this is from a man who dropped out after the 10th grade and never earned more than $27,000 in 1 year. And I said, 16 years old, well, what do you mean do something about it? He said, well, stop bringing home C's and D's on your report card. And that's a very important point. And the beautiful thing about the free market is its signaling mechanism. The information is never perfect. But in the theory of relativity, relative to the flow of information we get when government's in charge, where we never know how badly the government is ripping us off and how bad they're wasting our money, and even if they waste it, we can't fire them. At least Enron goes bankrupt before they have one congressional hearing. That's the free market. You lie, you cheat, you steal, you're gone. It may take a while, but it's not a perfect system. But if the government blows it, when's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, let's say we ruin the lives of the Indians, and then we go in and start giving them welfare, and we say, this is a good thing. Here's money for nothing. You'll have a 70% unemployment rate. Alcoholism will be rampant, but this is a good thing. We can't fire them for doing stupid things and cruel things to our first Americans. But the signaling mechanism of the free market tells everybody in this room, if you don't like where you are on the income spectrum, let's say you're making $8 an hour serving at a restaurant. If you don't like $8 an hour, the great thing about the interaction of supply and demand in the free market is that we've got everything from $8 an hour to Bill Gates per hour. And so all you've got to do is say, okay, I don't want $8 an hour, I want $80 an hour. Good. So go out there and gain information about what jobs pay $80 an hour. So you come up with a list. And it's a pretty good list, because we still have a relatively free market economy. So you get the list. Okay. Then you look at that list and say, where is my comparative advantage? Where do I fit in on the list? So you narrow it down to 2 or 3 things, and perhaps you pick a major that you believe will yield $80 an hour. And then, in a free market, you go about acquiring the necessary skills that raises the probability, not a certainty, not a certainty. It raises the probability that you'll get somewhere close to 80. You may end up with more than 80. I don't think Bill Gates expected to end up with his wealth. But that's also part of the free market. It signals people, if this is where you want to be, once you get there, and I know this is called greed, once you get to 80, you say, 80 is good, but boy, $200 an hour, that would be even better. And so you become a lawyer and sue everybody, and that's what you do. I know some people go to law school, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for saying that. Not really. So you get to 80 and then you want 200. So the free market gives you that information. In North Korea, in Cuba, where's the information flow is, you may want 80. You're going to get on a raft and start rowing from Florida if you want. You make it $80 a month if you're lucky. But again, all this was done. It was such a great idea. Workers around the world were being exploited. Marx said over time that profits would come down, that the only source of value in production was labor. It did not consider the role of the entrepreneur whatsoever. I tell some of my students when we talk about elasticity that I have a very inelastic demand for chapstick. I'm addicted to this stuff. It's like cocaine. All right. So I understand that the socialists say, well, the people who make chapstick probably make $6 an hour, and therefore they're probably being exploited. Well, go do something about it. You remember the movie Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum said, life finds a way? The market finds a way. And when it comes to income distribution, poor people in America are the richest poor people in the world. I would like for a poor person in America... let him go to India and say, I'm poor. And the Indian says, well, what do you have? If they go through the list, they're going to be laughed off of that country. Middle-class people in America are the richest middle-class people in the world. For those of you who are feminists, women in America are the richest women in the world. Rich people in America are the richest rich people in the world. Whatever you are. I'm gay and a feminist. Good? Gay feminists are the richest gay feminists in the world. Because the free market doesn't care about the feminism. It doesn't care about the gay. It cares about serving your fellow man. And if you serve your fellow man, you can end up, again, anywhere between complaining about Kentucky Fried Chicken to $80 an hour. Or Bill Gates money. And I'm nowhere near Bill Gates. But I've got to do something about it. I've got to write books. I've got to give speeches. I've got to do something. If I want to file a claim on my fellow man's private property, I don't go to my fellow man and say, I deserve this because I'm a public servant. My fellow man says, well, what if you picked teaching? You want more? I'm supposed to just give you more? No. Go do something to show that you deserve a claim on the income that I create. It's very simple. And again, I would never say the free market is perfect. But relative to every alternative that's been tried, please understand that I do disagree that when you say if we do everything based on economics, everything is based on economics. Because economics is a social science that looks at how we make decisions. Since everything we do is based on a decision, economics has everything to do with everything we do. Therefore, when we look around the world at the fact that the world is based on evidence, economics is an evidence-based science. If we look at the evidence all around the world, when people are given the opportunity to pick, they do not pick tyranny. They don't pick the gulag. They didn't pick the Berlin Wall. I can imagine the conversation while they were building the Berlin Wall. Excuse me, again, why are we building this wall? Well, listen, we're building this wall because communism is so great, we got to keep those East Germans out of here. We can't have them coming over here and participating in our system. We must keep them out. But it didn't happen that way. And you saw the people dying trying to get away. Why? Why were they doing that? Because even if they would come here and be exploited by capitalism, the exploitation of capitalism here was a whole lot better than the tyranny they got where they came from. That also goes to the mobility of resources. If you look at the people that come over here, while I believe America is the greatest country on earth, when I'm asked, well, prove that, I look at the people trying to get here compared to where people are trying to go compared to America. If you look at the number of people from Europe, from Asia, all over the world, they want to get here. And they want to get here not because of our social safety net. As a matter of fact, if you look around at immigrants, when they come over here, lower crime rate, lower incidence on welfare, better performance in schools, they actually appreciate what the Founding Fathers gave us. And I think one reason, and I say this with all respect, one reason why a more socialist view of the world is so often heard at colleges like Rollins. And if you have eggs or tomatoes, now's when you want to bring them out. At Rollins, correct me if I'm wrong, you have mostly white, mostly relatively wealthy people. Mostly, not all. When wealthy white folks who are 2 or 3 generations removed from the creation of that wealth, when it was their parents or their grandparents that used the free market to attain it, and then the kids benefit by getting a private school education from that wealth, it's easy to make them feel guilty. They didn't have to do that much in the free market. I'm not speaking about everybody, so remember, Robert Frost said education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or your self-confidence. Okay? So many people at Rollins, when they hear these high ideals of equality and of ecological freedom, they embrace this because of guilt. And knowing they're never going to have to live in the ghetto, they're never going to have to be poor, they're going to be okay, but at least while they're here, they can feel like they're doing something, or at least feeling something for their fellow man. If you were to deliver the equality of income lecture in many other places in the world where people are trying to get out of poverty, it wouldn't sell well. It would not sell well. One thing about the market that I think needs to be fixed. You may recall in 1998 in Indonesia, there were riots in the streets, thousands of people killed, hundreds of women gang raped, and it happened after the quick imposition, or the quick creation of a free market democracy, done overnight. Now, you had the Indonesians who saw 3% of the people, the Chinese, end up with 70% of the wealth very quickly. They had figured out markets. The markets had not really existed to any full extent in Indonesia. And so when the free market capitalism came, they weren't ready for it. And so now you have the government that has nationalized almost 60% of the resources of Indonesia, and people in the country is now slumping back into economic depression. The capitalists need to learn. Capitalists need to learn that if for the long run growth of capitalism, they need to give some consideration to treating people morally that work for them, to sell the people goods and services that are not fraudulently sold, where they're cheap and ineffective. Capitalists sometimes have a very short-run vision. Let's make what we can now without giving much consideration to the long run. And it's that, my friends, that in part gave us September the 11th. If you look at the history of our oil industry over in the Middle East, they went over there and found the stuff, and then they started paying wholesale prices that were very, very low to the various Arab nations over there. And then they'd bring the stuff back here, refine it into gasoline and petroleum byproducts, and they made a fortune. And if you read the Quran, there's a lot of verses in there. As a matter of fact, more verses in the Quran and in the Bible about money. The people who are Muslim, if they read the Quran talks about free trade to the benefit of both. It doesn't talk about the oil companies going over there and making a fortune off of the private property of the people in the Middle East. And so when they started to try to rein in the oil companies, when they would talk about forming OPEC or nationalizing their oil fields, the oil companies' reaction was, good. What are you going to do? Drink your oil? If you don't sell it to us, what are you going to do with it? And so this has bred a lot of resentment, the neo-colonialism that in large part came from our oil industry not having a long-run vision. Eventually, many of them did get nationalized. OPEC did come about, and they got booted out of the Middle East because they didn't think about the fact that in pure capitalism, in the long run, you don't perpetuate the zero-sum game. You serve your fellow man, you treat your fellow man with some level of dignity, and you'll actually make more profit in the long run from doing that. So the market sometimes fails to not have that long-run vision. So for those of you who are going to end up capitalists someday, give that some consideration. Short run, make the killing. Long run, maybe make less profit, but you'll make it for a longer period of time if you treat people decently. Thank you.
Is this working? Is this working? Okay, got 10 minutes.
12, actually.
12? Okay. Let me just address a couple pieces of data that were given that are in error. The richest poor people in the world, pardon. Just look at the data for Western Europe, and you won't find a group of poor people as bad off as ours, except maybe in Britain. Okay? In terms of the level of affluence, general level of affluence, and then consider the poor people. Okay, the best off poor people in the world are in Scandinavia and the Netherlands. In terms of any measure you would use. Any. Where are immigrants going now? Well, there's an equal number of illegal immigrants trying to get into Europe as getting into the United States.
We are moving out.
Pardon?
We are moving out from here.
I can't hear you.
We are moving out from here.
Okay, you got to be clear if you're going to make catcalls from the audience. I don't know what you're talking about.
The audience will have a chance to respond after Professor Rock does his 12 minutes, please.
The mobility data. Get ahead. Basically, it's like that guy you see on late night TV that buys the 20 minutes. You too can be a millionaire. Just get in there and fight the greatest place in the world. And you can not only get that, you get the government to subsidize you to do it, some of these, but he's obviously not arguing that. I anticipated this, so I brought some mobility data. These are data that people try to get a sense of where you're likely to move over your lifetime. And one of the startling things about this myth of mobility in the United States is we're actually much less mobile than some of the social democratic societies in Northern Europe that are ridiculed in Professor Chambless' book. I've got data here. Over 24 years, if you started in the lowest fifth of the distribution of income, 47% end up there 30 years later. If you start in the top fifth, 24 years later, 42% end up there. In fact, only about if you start in the bottom fifth, you've got about a 3% chance of going all the way to the top. Second fifth, you got a 9% chance. These are statistics based on data collected, not anecdotes. Okay? So I would argue that the mobility argument he's making, actually you can find societies in Western Europe with much more government intervention where mobility is actually much more the case. But you could argue that is the case. Partly because they've made sure that there is true equal opportunity for people rather than ours. where if you know anything about the labor market, you know that just because you got a BA doesn't mean you get into the door. The vast majority of people have contacts to make the first entry into any kind of employment they actually end up in. State as theft. I see this as harmful and immoral for him to argue such a thing. We like to criticize governments because they're very visible. But in some sense, when we celebrate the death of our warriors, when we celebrate our founders, when we celebrate our Constitution, what in God's name are we talking about? We're talking about the collective creation of our society. And so I find it downright immoral for someone to get up here and denounce it to such an extent when, in fact, by being born in America, we've won one of the world's biggest lotteries simply by being born here. In economic terms, if you were born in Bulgaria, your income would be 100th the level. So you could argue that 99% has nothing to do with any merit you have. Simply by being born here, you won the lottery. The Constitution, which is another favorite axe of Professor Chambliss. The Constitution is a living document. Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, to some extent tried to turn us away from the Constitution to point to the values enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and should be enshrined in perhaps our most sacred values. Well, if we simply went back and said, well, what would the founders want us to do? Every person in color here, please become my personal slave, because that is enshrined in our Constitution. 3/5 of a man. The original intent, to me, is as facetious an argument about economics as it is about who we should appoint to the Supreme Court. Equal opportunity. I would argue if you did a strong case study of countries that have really tried to create true equal opportunity that did not depend on your parents' income, your family background, all the benefits you get from being middle class or upper class, that you would find that in fact those societies are more based on merit, that you can have a market that can operate where people can actually get ahead because of what they achieve and how hard they work. And it's much less the case in the United States. We have anecdotes of success stories. But when we try to make generalization, as social scientists, we usually try to use statistics, not anecdotes. I'd like to talk about the vision we've got. I'm arguing that the government is our creation. We get the government we deserve to some extent because we fail to act and try to restrain the market elites who now have unbridled access to the government in a way that we haven't seen in 100 years, which is rotting the core of American democracy today. Just look at this energy bill, done in secret, only with oil companies. No nonprofit environmental organizations. No private citizens advocating more responsible oil-conserving policy. Produced and rammed through the Senate and the House, it looks like it's going to happen over the objections of the Democrats who are trying to bring it to our attention. But it is rotten at the core. Why do we have such a bill? Because government is bad in and of itself? No, it's because we've allowed the government to be captured by the elites and the super rich that our market system has produced, and especially produced in the last 2 decades with a fiscal policy guaranteed to produce even greater inequality than the market left on its own devices to achieve. Lastly, how do we try to choose a social system? There's not a really good way to think about this, but John Rawls came up with at least one way to make us think a little bit more than I think Professor Chambliss is suggesting. Before we say what is our preferred system, step back and imagine we have a random chance of being anyone in that world or that society. There's a veil of ignorance. We don't know where we're going to end up. What type of social system will we choose? He argued we would probably choose one that did something about the risk of being in the terrible situation of poverty that we find billion or 2 billion people in today on the world system, that we're trying to ram through a free trade, free market ideology that is not indigenous to many of these people who had a much more social connected political view of the world, social view of the world. So I would argue that he is in fact selling you a false utopia. There has never been a market system that is like what he talks about. He's taking us into the unknown if we follow him. And I'm on the left. I do not support North Korea or Cuba or East Germany. And if you wanted to find a place that I said was fairer, that used the market, it didn't abolish it, and actually improved the market in many cases, made it work better than it does in our society, I would look to Northern Europe. Several countries there. Thanks.
We'll now take questions from the audience. First, we'd like to have students, and then we'll call on some props. Yes, a lady here in the third row.
I have two questions for Professor Brock, and actually a quick statement. But first off, I've been so poor in this United States of America that I've actually qualified with United States welfare. And I can tell you at that point in my life, when I was on the point where I could have taken welfare and everything else from the government, I had a TV, I had a car, I had a mattress on my floor, I had food in my stomach. I consider myself to be a pretty rich poor person. Thankfully, I've been able to work my way up since then because I have the freedom to do so. And I have that piece of the American dream. I have a house and fiance and everything else, education on the way. Now my question is, according to leftist thinking, the labor and the productivity of the labor is the most important thing. If that is true, how do you explain the higher unemployment rates in socialist countries?
Which ones are you talking about?
Germany, France, they're double to triple what we are here.
Denmark?
Even
Okay,
worse.
Denmark's is lower.
So if socialism is basing
Sweden
itself
is
on
lower.
the maximization of labor and in being employed is freedom itself, then where is the freedom in being unemployed and standing in bread lines?
I didn't follow that last question. You want the freedom to stand in bread lines?
No, I'm saying that socialism creates bread lines, and if you're standing in a bread line, where is the freedom in your life? If you're standing in line for 13% of the unemployment pie in Germany, where is your freedom?
I think you need to study how unemployment and the labor market works in those countries if you really want to talk about them. To be quite frank. The labor market in Scandinavia and in Germany, they have public offices where you can go in and check on computers. And in Scandinavia in particular, it gives you a pretty comprehensive view of the opportunities across the country. If you've lost your job, there's also training opportunities. So to some extent we say, during your course of life, you're likely to have some trouble, and maybe you need some education, not necessarily when you're 18 or 20, but rather when you're 30 or 40 or 50. So there are educational programs that are put in place that they collaborate with the unions, employers, as well as the government, to try to figure out how to reinsert these people. In the case of Germany, I would point out that until they absorbed East Germany in 1989 to several following years, it cost them massive subsidies. They were spending 4% of their GDP per year just to subsidize the incomes of the people in East Germany as they absorbed them, because they, to some extent, made a political decision by conservative, pro-free market parties, by the way. The CDU and CSU, that is Christian Democrat, Christian Socialism, from Bavaria, where their strength is, not from the left-wing Social Democratic Party. So I would say that to some extent you're not standing in a bread line. And I'm not sure what you're referring to there. And it somehow says we are a society, so we make collective an insurance system so that when your job gets eliminated for whatever reason, you don't pay all the costs, because they can be tremendously severe. In our system, what happens? You lose your job, you may lose the pension, you lose your health care, and as I said, for 60% of families in America, you may find the equity in your house evaporate. So we privatize those costs, and we put all those costs on an individual. I would argue by socializing them. In fact, we make the market smoother, because people are not going to go out and create damage and violence facing job loss, because they will. Let me finish, and I'll let you start. You want to go ahead? I'll let you.
Oh no, you asked to finish. I'm letting you.
Okay.
Okay. Over there, yes.
Both gentlemen can respond to this. I think a lot of people would agree on two things: that responsibility and education are the key elements of being successful in life. And when looking at our society, we compare us to, say, the Denmark and the Northern Europe, that we have a different idea of responsibility and education in this country. It's been read on by a lot of things. But what do you think about your comparison between the U.S. and Northern Europe? That we have problems in our education system that's created, that hasn't been able to fix some of the problems. The Denmark and Northern Europe doesn't have the problems in education and the citizenry that we have because of the education and responsibility that their citizens take for themselves and their families.
It's a good question. We are much larger, more complex. We also have an immigration policy that brings in lots of low-income people with low educational achievement prior to entering here. So it'll be much more complicated to do. That if you're going to do such a thing, you'd have to deal with immigration in some thoughtful and real way. But I guess your question is oriented towards, could we have something like that? Is that
No, my question is that, because what you just said, we are so much complicated that to compare our system with what's going on in Northern Europe, you can't do that. They're living in a much different situation than what we are. And then it was back to my idea that the free market is the best way to go, free market economy, society, and that the best way for the people to deal with that society is through responsibility and education that should come throughout their life from their parents and from the local schools.
Yeah, I'm on the left, but I do believe in personal responsibility. And I would argue that you could make a comparison with, say, the Europe of the 12, the European Union and us, or Japan, until recently, until they adopted more radical pro-free market policies in the 80s, late 80s, that you could argue that we can achieve a whole lot more, and we choose not to. We choose to be the stingiest rich country in the world as far as helping the third world. And we choose to be along with Britain, in competition to the race to the bottom, the stingiest nation in the world as far as dealing with our people at risk, disabled, elderly, orphans, as well as unemployed people.
That's nonsense. Yes, I'll get to that. But first of all, I do take offense to you using the word immoral to talk about my view. Others made it very clear that the government is to use our property for three reasons, and three reasons only. It's called Article 1, Section 8. They can lay and collect taxes, do these imposts and excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and the general welfare of the people. When people died on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, they are doing just that. So I don't see the government as theft when the government is doing what it's supposed to do, which is to protect us from violence and protect us from foreign invasion. I don't see the government engaging in theft when they do things that are for the general welfare of the public. That means to do things that benefit all of us. Secondly, Perhaps you should reread the Constitution to see that the 3/5 of a person issue for black people wasn't because the Founding Fathers viewed black people as less. The northern states insisted on counting black people as 3/5 of a person, so it would reduce the overall population of the South, so the South wouldn't be able to dictate domestic policy for the next 100 years. What's nonsense? We spend $500 billion a year on social welfare programs in the United States of America. Here's the data on the GDP for every country in the world. Take a look at what the GDP is of those countries. We give more to our own people. We give $2 billion a year to the rest of the world in terms of foreign aid. I agree in one sense with respect to Great Britain and the United States. And that's on the issue of the war with Iraq. I was never in agreement with us. I don't think there was any constitutional justification for doing what we did in Iraq. It was not our affairs to go liberate the people from Iraq. We haven't liberated the people from North Korea. They've got a dictator and they have nuclear weapons. But we do give to our own people, remember, $240 billion a year for private charity. $500 billion in tax money. That's half the budget that goes to take care of our people. We're getting ready to add prescription drugs. We haven't told the senior citizens we're going to reject them for Social Security. If you look at Germany, the problem with Germany is that it's not a free market problem in Germany. If you look at the election of Gerhard Schroeder, it comes in and raises taxes in Germany, imposes new regulations in Germany. The labor unions that average almost $23 an hour now, but only want to work 35 hours a week, as their jobs leave. The BMW leaves for South Carolina, and they're standing there wondering, well, I'm supposed to get $23 an hour. Why has BMW left for South Carolina? The Germans don't seem to understand. They don't get the disconnect between the government doing all of these social welfare programs and destroying the incentives of individuals. We're not a society. We are individuals who make up society. There's no... your money is not society's money, as I've heard other socialists say. Your money is your money. Okay? And we make decisions as a society, and overall, the American people, as individuals, have made a lot of benevolent, charitable choices. And so, if we look at the issue of what's going on in Northern Europe, a much more homogenous population, very similar ethnic backgrounds, very similar religion. It's a lot in smaller populations. It's a lot easier to do these things if it's more culturally accepted. We're so diverse here that to have any uniformity to expand the social welfare network would be very, very difficult to do. And I don't even think we should do it.
Okay, we have another question from the student over here.
So I have a question for you. I kept on hearing vet is vet throughout your presentation, and your money is your money. But I was just wondering, where was this money originally justly acquired? Or like when you were working at KFC, to use your own example, those people were exploiting you, and you said you deserved...
That was a joke, by the way. Please don't take it. I wanted to cater to some people that might feel like you feel.
Okay, fine. So you have a minimum wage, you're not getting enough money. Are those people that are being paid minimum wage while someone else is getting a lot of money, is that justly acquired money?
So, did I justly acquire the money from Kentucky Fried Chicken? And
no,
do I just...
Sorry, you misunderstood my question.
Okay.
The people who, let's say, own that franchise, they're paying the minimum wage. Are they justly acquiring the profit that they're going to use to send their rich white kids to Rollins? That's my question.
Okay. First of all, the problem is in defining the word justly. Justice, in some cases, is in the eye of the beholder. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. Deserve is in the eye of the beholder. All I know is, nobody put a gun to my head and said, boy, go into Kentucky Fried Chicken and start working. Their information was clear. Kid, if you want to work here, here's what we pay, $3.35 an hour. Do you agree or disagree? If I disagree, I could take my labor services somewhere else to seek a better standard of living. I could stop making C's and D's on my report card, which thankfully I did. Is it justly acquired? Under the definition that you're giving, or I think you have, of whether it's justly acquired, everybody in this room could argue, no, it's not justly acquired because they made more than me. And everybody in the room could say, yes, it was justly acquired because they engaged in a contract that was totally voluntary with that individual 20 years ago. So it's the definition of justice, in this case, that would have to be more clearly defined. But the problem is, it's very difficult to define it, isn't it? And those who make $7 an hour might always be more inclined to say this is not justice.
Two questions for Dr. Chambliss.
It's Mr. Chambliss, by the way.
What?
It's Mr. Chambliss, if you don't know.
Okay, sorry. You referenced that developing economies are responsible for more pollution. Do you have any proof of any kind that that's not from outsourcing a highly polluted industry from developing economies to developing countries?
Sure, if you will, and I hate to pass the buck this way, but if you would see me after this debate, you and anybody else that wants the data, and in case you wonder if I get it from the polluters, I'll bring you my tax refund to show you the long list of environmental groups I give money to, okay, if that helps you. But the data comes from the people that are actually fighting to clean up the environment. The data from Mexico, from Eastern Europe, from China. If we look around the world at the countries that are making improvements, several years ago there was a study done by a couple of guys at Princeton that showed that initially as countries began to develop, until they reach about $4,000 per capita income, they tend to do more damage to the environment as they're developing. And once they hit $4,000 per capita income, they become a net protector of the environment rather than a net damager of the environment. Because it's in their interest to do that. They've got somebody in Mexico, if you were to go to them and say, listen, you really need an EPA, they'd say, well, no, I really need food. So poor people don't have the resources to think about acquiring these things, and they don't have the money to put wet and dry scrubber technology, the power plants, all these things that we do, either through the government or on our own in the free market. So I can certainly get you there.
To follow up before I ask the next question, so then you would say it would be unfair to help them to get above that $4,000 range so they're not damaging the world?
Oh, no. I want to see poor countries helped tremendously through free trade, through pragmatic market reforms over time. Again, not the sudden shocks to their system that has hurt Russia, the oil tycoon. We have these economies in transition, and sometimes our capitalists say, hey, do it now, and they can't do it now. It takes a while to emerge. But I certainly would advocate, if you want to see them clean up the environment, there's got to be some level of wealth acquired over time. Because until then, they're going to be more concerned about taking care of their basic needs than they are about the quality of the water or the air. Did I answer your question?
Well, you said in your article, and I'm paraphrasing in the Constitution, you generally explained that the government is only allowed to promote general welfare of the people. By general welfare, would you say that you mean the privilege of not having your face hacked open by a machete as you starve in the streets like in Liberia? Or would you say promoting general welfare entails infrastructure, proper education, and health care as a responsibility morally and fiscally of the government and the citizens of that government?
Okay, first of all, the term health care never shows up in the Constitution.
No, the only part I was paraphrasing is the general welfare.
Okay, let me get to the general welfare. When the founders, and there's a wonderful book called Vindicating the Founders by Thomas G. West, if you want to take a look at the dialogue they had about it. I'm trying to answer your question.
Sorry to interrupt. No, you're missing the point. I'm asking what your stance on welfare is. Would you say
I'm trying to get there.
Or the latter? I mean, you love extreme examples, so I just wanted to take.
Okay, if you'll let me finish, and this is a good story, but give me 2 minutes, okay?
Okay.
When the founders, who I agree with, debated this issue of general welfare, they did not argue, with the exception of one, Alexander Hamilton, who made one 5-hour speech during the Constitutional Convention, where he argued for a monarchy, the elimination of states' rights, etc. With the exception of Hamilton, they all agreed that the general welfare clause meant spending our property for the betterment of all, to protect life, liberty, and property. Hamilton argued for a much broader definition of the general welfare clause to allow for this living document interpretation of the Constitution. From the ratification of the Constitution until 1936, the general welfare clause did not entertain those things. Every time it came up, there was an issue of French refugees that came over here, and Congress wanted to appropriate money for them. And the President said, I cannot lay my finger on that part of the Constitution that allows for the spending on objects of benevolence, the tax money of the people. In 1936, in the Supreme Court case, Butler versus the United States, when the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt were being challenged, the Supreme Court worried that Franklin Roosevelt would pack the Supreme Court with people sensitive to his agenda. In the Butler versus the United States case, they clearly sided with Alexander Hamilton as the authority on the term general welfare, meaning It's no longer constrained to the list of things under Article 1, Section 8. It's anything that Congress wants to do. The dilemma with that is, the moment that Congress decides that they can do anything with our money and call it general welfare, your pocketbook is free game to everything they want to do, even if it seems like a good thing. So with the machete and what have you, no, general welfare doesn't apply. That the part about protecting your life does. But I believe in a strict interpretation of Article 1, Section 8. Look at what the founders intended, to save your money from plunder for the rest of your life. Whether it's plunder of $87 billion or plunder of the National Endowment for Arts. You're not listening, you're feeling, but you're not thinking.
No,
this is why you're doing this. You're not thinking, you're feeling.
Why? Because you have an extremely fundamentalist view and you're dodging the question. I'm asking.
I'm not dodging the question. I'm trying to give you a historical understanding of general welfare to tell you I believe in a strict interpretation of it. Period.
Okay.
I don't know how more clear
So
it can be.
in a democratic society, you wouldn't say that it would be good for the people to decide what general welfare is? You want to take a fundamentalist view from
Democracy,
250 years ago?
if you really want democracy, democracy is that close to tyranny because democracy is built on a fallacy. And the fallacy is that the majority is always right.
The blonde hair right there.
I don't believe in God.
Could you speak up, please?
Okay, I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm pre-vested at Rollins. I get to go to med school basically for free.
No, you don't. Taxpayers pay for it. Just make it clear.
Let us finish your question.
I'm sorry.
I get to go to med school basically for free. It costs 1,500 euros per year. I'm in a pre-med class, and the vast majority of the kids are never going to get to go to med school because they can't afford it. Is that freedom? Are you free to go to med school?
You have an interest. You have an interest in going to medical school. You don't have a right to go to medical school.
Why not?
The moment you call something a right, the government has to protect it with no questions asked. If you call it a right to medical school, somebody else can say, wait a minute, she has a right to medical school, I have a right to a house. So the list becomes endless. And I'd like to ask you, where does all this money come from to preserve the expanded list of your rights?
Society where we are willing to pay 50% income tax to protect my rights to education and housing.
No, you don't. You're living in America right now. Okay. That's great for your society. I'm glad your society feels that way. And once 50%, in Sweden, the average tax burden is 62%. I had a student from Denmark, I don't know if this is accurate, they said his sister made the equivalent of $45,000 that put her in the 73% tax bracket. There was once a point in time in America's history we had a 94% marginal tax bracket. I always tell my students, you can have anything you want as long as you're willing to pay for it. It's just that if we look at the fact that baby boomers are about to retire, and all of the other things we're going to have to pay for that aren't part of the discretionary part of the budget, if we expand that list much further, we will get to your 50% tax burden. But I'd be willing to bet the same people that threw, the descendants of the people that threw tea in the Boston Harbor are going to reject 50% of their income going to government benevolence.
You speak of self-interest in specific, having to deal with the capitalist markets. And my question for you is, it's in my self-interest to use my family's money or any money that I can get a hold of with reasonable, respect to my moral beliefs and things that I do in my life. And if I use this to go to Rollins or even to VCC or wherever I need to go to get my education, I get a better education. I go out and I take a job from someone who, though is very skilled, may make much less than me in my lifetime. And basically what ends up happening is I increase the number of poor people because I can do the job of 3. Because I'm educated, because I have money to do this. Because I've gone out and taken this self-interest one step farther. But it is also in their self-interest to do the same thing. But I ask you, if this is happening, why is poverty becoming such an issue in this country? Even though I'm going out and fulfilling my self-interest, I'm screwing someone.
Who would like to take that?
Mr. Chambliss, and then Dr. Rock.
I've been talking enough. Why don't you take it first?
Let me just deal with the general logic of the arguments. There's an assumption of a world full of employment. So if somebody doesn't do this job, they'll move into another. And if you look at the labor supply on a world scale, 6 billion people, maybe about 3 billion will work. There's seriously 1 billion of those who are underemployed by most accounts. So to some extent, when a job is lost and moved somewhere else, it's not guaranteed that it will be replaced by anything like the equivalent job. We hope that would be the case. We hope that people get more education. We hope that more jobs arise through the market, through public policy. But we're never guaranteed of that. And the person, the individual person, it can have a devastating effect on their life, their family. If you know anything about families, you know that infidelity and financial crisis are the 2 main causes of couples splitting up, effects on the kids. So that, I guess I would just add with that healthcare, is one of the things that disturbs me about this debate, and why I use the term immoral, Mr. Chambliss, is that he is effectively condoning poverty and misery, because when you study the actual history of the United States over its long trajectory, there's a wonderful book called From Poor Law to Welfare State by a guy named Tratner. I actually use in a course on nonprofits and social programs. It chronicles from the very onset, we had terrific poverty problems at the very beginning of the colonial era. And we dealt with them in a variety of ways, usually through collective action, often through instruments of government or quasi-government, even from the very beginning. So that poverty, or in a sense being lost in the market system, there will always be a substantial share of the population that does not have a market value. And that will sometimes include significant numbers of the able-bodied, as well as elderly, children, orphans, widows, single parents with many children, those types of things.
I'm trying to figure out a way to discourage you from feeling bad about getting a job today. If you believe that your getting a job displaces 3 people, that there's a positive relationship between educated individuals using their self-interest to gain full employment and the number of poor people lose their jobs, then over time, as America has become more productive and more educated, we would see a rising unemployment rate rather than a falling unemployment rate. Even in our most recent recession, unemployment bounced around 6.5%. It's around 6% right now. And if you look at poverty in America compared to what it used to be, one problem with the way we measure poverty, we usually rely on census data. Census data does not take into account transfer payments. It doesn't take into account property that an individual might have. It just looks at income. But if we look at income plus property and government assistance, we see that poverty is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. It would not be in my interest to see a society where more people were poor, because the more poor people we have in a place where poor people can vote, the more they would be inclined to use their votes to use force to take away the wealth. It's a breeding revolution if you advocate poverty. So the fact that you're going to end up being an engineer someday, I don't know what, those 3 people haven't lost their jobs because they don't have the skills necessary at that moment to become an engineer. And so, if you're concerned about these individuals, where else but in a quasi-free market economy would you have more opportunities to start a new business and employ poor people, middle-class people, and other successful people? You're going to be far more likely to help the lives of poor people through entrepreneurship and investment and you're using your productivity than you will if you feel guilty about their status and leave it at that. The world's not a zero-sum game. Wealth is constantly being generated, and while the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting richer too, but at a slower rate than rich people. It's because they don't have as much skills and education and training. So don't feel guilty.
This is a question for both, and it's more of like a teacher towards a student towards a teacher, just trying to understand. Chambliss says that democracies will fail. You believe democracies are successful. Everything I've read promotes that markets are democracies, that they're individuals voting where their money goes and who receives it. And for Chambliss to be in favor of a market which supports democracy, which encourages it in the market, but to say that it fails, and for him to say that he's democratic, but yet opposes a market which is a democracy, I've been weighing it for weeks, and I'd just like to hear opinions from both.
Yeah, the idea that a dollar should be counted like a human being is beyond my comprehension of democracy. Okay? So that people who argue it's just the same as where our dollar goes is a way of conflating real democracy, political democracy, human democracy with market power. Because if you look at the distribution of income and wealth in the United States, the top 20% can outvote everyone else. If we want that type of democracy, fine. If that's what you want to advocate, fine. I just consider it improper to argue that you're promoting democracy by advocating a system that produces such results. Guilt. I wouldn't say, in a sense, feeling guilt, you can only do so much. But to argue that you shouldn't feel any guilt and you shouldn't worry about your fellow men and women, to me, that strikes me as base immorality. From my point of view, that if you aren't connected to human beings on this earth, well, you're just like a wild, isolated animal in the forest. You're not human, in my opinion. And that's why I feel very strongly about this, that this type of argumentation and this type of indoctrination of young people to make them so venomous against their government that they would never even touch it, and all the people who feel this way, if they ever get power, they just want to destroy the institution of the marrow of democracy. I see this as downright dangerous for our future of our democracy.
To answer your question, you didn't want both of us.
Yes, yes.
Economic democracy is very different than political democracy. Everybody in this room acting in their self-interest to buy and sell things. There's too many of us to coordinate as a special interest group. This is the reason why sometimes when you guys get the emails about how we should all boycott Exxon when gas prices go up, you look at the email and go, well, that's absurd. There's so many of us to organize. How could we all possibly agree to a boycott of Exxon? So you go on and buy your gasoline wherever you want. So in economic democracy, it's very difficult to coordinate us into special interest groups to make decisions that are going to work to the detriment of our fellow man. In political democracy, we tell everybody, show up on November the 5th and check off what you think. And so political democracy, in many cases, is a lot easier to have people coordinate to use special interest groups, whether it's corporations that use special interest groups to steal from their fellow man, or other individuals that want to steal from their fellow man. So it's, the term democracy here is different when you're talking about the way we conduct ourselves in the market versus the way we conduct ourselves politically. And on the issue of the morality of indoctrinating people, you guys need to understand that the bulk of college professors around the country, just ask them, and if they're honest with you, they tend to lean to the left.
In economics, I doubt it.
Okay? That said, most college professors lean to the left. So I view it as balanced to have my students hear a civil and economic libertarian at least call into question what the government is doing, while they also call into question whether or not the free market has some moral responsibilities to people as well. Again, it's not a zero-sum game where if I gain, somebody else must lose. I have to care enough about myself. Love your fellow man. I have to care enough about myself to tell my fellow man, here's how you'll see my self-love. I'm going to work very hard for you so that I'll get something in return. And most of the time, if the rules are enforced by government, and government needs to do these things, people will act in their self-interest and create the positive, not the negative sum game.
I won't take it practical. That's my problem. I hear a lot of should. In the best of all possible worlds, I'm 100% with you. But then there's the real world. I'm concerned with the fact that students seem to relish this brave world in which we live. And it doesn't look so good when you look at it. There are a tremendous amount of problems. So you perhaps haven't been exploited at a fast food place where you work. But a lot of the success around us today is based on massive expropriation of private property, slavery. It started us off in very good terms. You mentioned exploitation of the third world, and I applaud you for accepting that. Free trade isn't working. I want a bit of a concrete position. How do we do it? If the rich were honorable and charitable, it would be wonderful. But they're not, are they? Most of them. Some of them. Enough to make the world look like it really does. And the problems aren't here in the third world. The problems are here too. I'm sure that when you talked about how good the healthcare in America is, a lot of anybody who experienced healthcare in other rich countries probably snickered. Certainly thinking about Holland a little bit, because it's been ranked by American specialists very low, and anybody else who goes to the local doctor with a good insurance plan knows that it sucks in more ways than one. So what are we going to do? How are you going to implement these reforms?
That's great. First of all, if I can ask you for a moment, just think about it as a continuum. A pure free market, which again, I mentioned we don't have that in Turkey, or absolute government tyranny. The people that argue that they were communists, they never got there. The Soviet athletes, they made more money than the peasants on the street. So Fidel Castro's not in a breadline. So on the extremes of each case, what we might ask is, in which direction do we want to go? More and more government providing us with more rules and regulations and more security, where we pay perhaps higher taxes to achieve it? Or do we want to recognize that we are not anywhere near a utopia of people being productive and honest and always doing things to perpetuate their self-interest in a way their fellow man is better off? I simply believe that over time, the more we can resist moving in the direction of government, the better off we'll be. We can look at where we are, and I think we should continue to work to move more towards the free market. Anything that plagues the free market, in my opinion, can be answered with more freedom, not less. If you've ever read the book, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, he paints the picture of what happens when over time we turn over more and more of our freedom to government. It's inevitable over time that the more power we give government, the less freedom we have, the less happiness we have, the less wealth we have. So it's because of my mistrust of so much that government does that I would rather err on the side of pushing for more freedom rather than more government, all the while recognizing we're not at where I would like to be. That's the best I can do to answer your question.
But how will you have a chance of succeeding with the vested interest? How will you avoid plutocracy, the regime of the rich? How would you avoid that, since the political power is maybe a form of government in a big way, very skewed?
If you look at other countries around the world where the rich do help plunder their fellow man, and you've got horrible income inequality, look at what we get in those countries. Oftentimes we get revolution. We get radical changes in government systems over time. I think a forward-thinking capitalist would not want to push us into a system where the rich are incredibly rich and everybody else is poor. After all, you're either going to end up with revolution, or if everybody else is poor, who are the rich people going to sell their products to?
I'm not sure you're addressing this to me, but first of all, this Professor Chambliss keeps pointing to me when he talks about dictatorships. Okay. I told you at the very beginning I am not in favor of any country that has a dictatorship. I usually evaluate countries first by what would happen to me if I went and sat on the street corner and started enunciating my ideas. And most of the countries we use to try to think me with that hard Russia and anti-socialism, I wouldn't defend in political terms. They're mostly not in economic terms, too. I would say practically that you really need to focus on democracy, because we really do have a rotting system here. And the more we allow this rhetoric of this free market utopian vision, which, remind you, has never existed anywhere on the globe, ever, in any real form. If you go back to our colonial period, you could say, well, that was sort of like it, wasn't it? Yeah, but it was not much more than more than 80% of the families had their own productive property. Okay, they could produce their wherewithal on their own. So I would argue that you really have to address the problem of corruption in the American political system, whereby we already have a plutocracy, a market elite, that to some extent has captured the great majority of both major political parties today in the funding of campaigns, in the funding of lobbyists, and their ability to get what they want and the perks that they give to congressmen, senators, and people in government. And they know if they play well when they come out, they will be rewarded with a massive sinecure, a well-paid job for the general in the military production side of the economy. Lobbyists will go around and lobby the same organizations they were appointed to. So to some extent, I'm a political person in the sense that I say, I don't think we can do all that much until there really is a political groundswell that will try to overturn the power of money that dominates all American political life today.
You're giving a speech. Do you have a question?
Yes. My question is this. Without, like, what you call greed, without that, where do we find progress? That's my question.
A little bit towards a Marxist friend here. Now, I come from a place where we have a 50% income tax. It's known as Minnesota, where we have economists that believe like that we should have a nice social welfare. Now, I've been working in that state for years now. I've worked also on the higher end of the private sector, and I've also been in bread truck for 16 hours a day with the lower of the lowest class people. I know both ends. All of the companies in Minnesota are now leaving because we have such a wonderful social welfare system, and in return, we're getting the dregs of Detroit and Chicago. Our crime rate is constantly increasing. Now, from what I can deduce, you say that I don't deserve what I earn, that you would propose taking it from me because I earn it and giving it to somebody else because for some reason I don't deserve it. That's forced benevolence. And as far as I know, forced benevolence can also be known as slavery.
Would you please sort of turn your mini speeches into questions? Okay, these are the things we're supposed to do.
I want him to tell me to my face why I don't deserve what I earn.
Thank you.
I didn't deny that people can be greedy. I just said that we should not celebrate it and make it the shrine before which we bow as the basis for our entire social and political system. And I argue that Chambliss proposes that, to put it in a shrine and to worship around it, and through that greed, we get a lot of side effects as well, which is instrumentalism, treating people like instruments of my desires rather than other human beings, equal right to be on the earth. I guess the Minnesotan, I've got most of my relatives in Minnesota, so I know the place pretty well. And I've heard your speech before from about half of them, because they're middle class, and they don't like the Vietnamese and the other minorities. You mentioned the people from Detroit, but I think I know mine.
Are you calling me a racist, sir?
I'm saying
I don't want it on a moral level. Okay, I'm going to tell you I'm an insensitive guy. You don't need to argue that. Please just tell me why I don't deserve
it. I think all of us know what you mean.
Don't call me a racist.
I know because my aunt talks about the problems she's got with running the minority high school in the center of Minneapolis, and the attitudes of many working-class whites extremely hostile to social welfare programs.
You're avoiding my question, though. You're attacking me on a moral level, and you're avoiding
I'm saying by being born in America, you already won the lottery. Okay? And I would commend you for working and since benefiting the rest of us, just like we've benefited on the work of all the previous generations. We were lucky to win the lottery to be born here. Second, okay, if we want to have a good society, if you look at our history, we've always thought about the people with little and difficult problems. We've always been harsher to the people who are able-bodied and don't seem to be attempting to turn their lives around. But if you look at Northern Europe and these people, okay, there's pressures on them to try to get them to conform, because there will be free riders. Just like at Enron, you have free riders, just like among middle-class faculty, you have people who free ride on the work of others. Just like anywhere you will find this. But what I'm saying is I'm not willing to tolerate a society where people can die on the streets or not have access to health care or all sorts of other social phenomena which used to exist in this country before the Great Society programs in the 30s and the 60s. I don't want to live in a society like that because I consider it immoral to not help our fellow citizens.
On the issue of progress, very quickly, first of all, I'd like to caution you, if you want to further your agenda, and I agree with, in principle, what you're saying, try not to use the word greed, because greed can imply I gain and the other person's not better off or worse off, or I gain and the other person is worse off. It is enlightened self-interest. When people who are anti-markets, the first thing they say is, well, it's based on greed. Try to get them to understand enlightened self-interest instead of greed, because greed can imply that you might be willing to hurt your fellow man. And secondly, winning the lottery implies that we were just here and didn't do anything, and we have a ticket and we cashed in. We earned it. We earned it with blood. We earned it with free markets. We earned it with entrepreneurism. And along the way, those earnings have created the social safety net that you want. And what's so ironic to me is that people who are the most willing to advocate nationalization and more government are the least willing to live in those countries where that's going on.
Are you insinuating that we are earning before we are born?
No. We're born into a system where it's not a lottery. It's a system when, as we become consenting adults, the free market signals us as to what productive behavior is. We act on that, and then we begin to earn. But the system has to be there. The lottery implies you don't have to do anything. You show up at 7-Eleven, and for nothing, or for $1, you win. It's not a lottery. You become become self-aware, you act on your free will, and you create the wealth you gain over time.
I'm referring to, let me just make this clear because I've used it several times. The lottery is, you win, it's not a cash prize on the barrel. But what it does is it multiplies by 10 anything that you earn, with no personal responsibility for that, simply being an American. If you were in Bulgaria, your salary would be 1/80th, doing exactly the same work simply by the fact that you were born here.
Because the government for years, under the same stuff we hear over here, socialism that led to communism, the Bulgarians are poor because of government, not because of market.
Turkey. Let me take 50 other countries. I know Bulgaria, I lived there, so I know exactly what the margin of the lottery is. I'm using that as an example.
Which it makes it all the more shameful that you couldn't recognize who destroyed the wealth.